This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Our very special guest this week is in Brasilia, capital of Brazil. We're talking to the André Borges, who's the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Brasilia, or Universidade de Brasilia. He is also one of the editors of an award-winning book, The Recasting of the Latin American Right, Polarisation and Conservative Reactions. So welcome on the LatinNews Podcast.
Okay, thanks. It's good to be here with you.
It's a great pleasure to be discussing Brazil at this moment in time. Obviously, we have elections on the horizon in October, but also we need to put this all into context with what is taking place around the world, and indeed Brazil's cooling economy, and in the wake and the continuing issue of the banking scandal with Banco Master. So perhaps you could put Brazil's actual situation into context for us.
Okay, great. I think the first thing I should mention is that we are probably going to have a very hotly contested election. As some of you may know, in 2022, 4 years ago, when Lula was elected president, he did so by a very tiny margin of the vote. And I think we're going to see the same scenario once again. This time, Lula is running for re-election, and his main opponent is Bolsonaro, who is one of the four sons of former President Jair Bolsonaro. And opinion polls show that Lula and Flávio Bolsonaro, they are very close to each other. In simulations of runoff election, actually, they are in a technical tie. So this makes me think we are going to see a very tight election. And right now, my impression is that the incumbent government is having some trouble in terms of converting economic gains in the last 4 years into popularity. Because right now, Brazil has inflation under control. Unemployment is at historically low levels, but yet Lula's popularity is stagnated. And there has been a lot of debate on why is that, what is exactly going on. And surely that's where the Banco Master case could help us to understand, what is going on in voters' minds. Because to give you like a broad picture of what this is about, the Master Bank, we have just realized that mayors and state governors from different states, they were buying titles signed off by Master Bank. And we have learned that many of these titles, they had no kind of coverage. Actually, they were the owner of the Master Bank has been arrested by fraud. And it seems that several politicians, judges, and other high-ranking officials, they were involved in the scam. And it seems that part of the population thinks that the government, the Lula government, is to be blamed by this scandal. Although, actually, when we look at the ideological leanings of the state governors who were actually involved in these operations, most of these governors, they are actually right-wing. They are closer to former President Bolsonaro than to Lula, but yet many voters think that if there is a scandal, the government is to be blamed for it. And I think this is not hard to understand, because usually when something goes wrong, the incumbent government is going to take part of the blame. And it does not help the fact that we have some Supreme Court judges who have had some, let's say, troubling liaisons with Daniel Vorcaro, which is the former owner of Banco Master. And because many voters, especially those voters with more right-wing leanings, they tend to think that the Supreme Court is closed, aligned with Lula. So they probably makes them think that in the end, this is a left-wing scandal, because the Supreme Court is leftist. We have some Supreme Court judges who are involved, and the left is responsible for this. And I suspect that this is one of the explanations why Lula's popularity does not grow. It's stagnated.
Is there any way that Lula can try to distance himself from this scandal?
I think that what the government is going to try to do is probably to associate the scandal to Flávio Bolsonaro, to the opposition presidential candidate. And this is because Flávio Bolsonaro, he bought a house, a luxury house here in Brasilia. And it seems that this house was sold by one of the companies that were part of the Master holding. It's a very dubious business. And he never explained exactly how he got the money to pay for it. We are talking of a reais house, which is something like $3 million. And obviously, you can't buy a house like that with your salary, senator. So I suspect that Lula's campaign is going to try to say, look at the other side. These guys, they are also. And also, there are several right-wing governors here in Brasilia. Brasilia is actually a sort of city-state because instead of a mayor, we have a governor. And the governor of Brasilia, he tried to use because Brasilia has a public bank, an investment bank called BRB. It's the regional bank of Brasilia. And Inês Rocha, who is the governor of Brasilia, he tried to use the regional bank to buy the master bank. It's a very complicated story because up to now, no one has been able to explain why the Bank of Brasilia tried to buy a private bank who everyone else knew was in trouble. And if you had a look at the balance sheets of this bank, you would say, we can't buy this thing. This is obviously, we are going to have serious issues here. In the end, the Master Bank was not bought, but obviously, as you can imagine, he and his group here in Brazil, they are in trouble because now they have to explain what exactly, was going on. And so it seems to me that we are going to have a war of narratives because on the one hand, the Liberal Party, which is Bolsonaro's party, is going to try to say that the Lula government is responsible for the scandal. And then the other side is going to, no, this is not the case. Look at all these right-wing governors. And some of them, they were actually supported by Bolsonaro in the past, and they are involved in this scam. And so that's what I'm expecting we are going to see in the months to come. But I don't know if I missed your question. Yeah, because you asked if Lula, if there could be a way for him to distance himself. I think the exact answer to this question is I'm not very sure. Because as I said, this is going to be a war of narratives. And this country is very much polarized. And I think that's the issue. I think Brazilian politics has become more like American politics. And I might say that this is not good. No, this is not good at all because we have a very divided country. And even voters' evaluation of the economy is filtered by partisan lens. And I think that's the other issue because those voters who like Bolsonaro, who identify with the Liberal Party, they tend to have a much more negative view about the economy. Although in objective terms, if we look at economic indicators, it's better. There is no question about that. In terms of any indicator, you can name it. GDP growth, inflation, unemployment, everything is much better now than it was 4 years ago. But yet, as I said, this has not been enough for Lula to get, this is not going to make Lula have an easy election.
Lula is running for his fourth non-consecutive term. It's pretty incredible when you talk about this. Perhaps we should just explain quickly to some of the listeners, the Banco Master scandal, if you're not aware, is a sophisticated fraud and money laundering network, which in the end has been seen to involve organized crime groups operating within the mainstream financial ecosystem. It's a serious situation. This would bring down a government in another situation, I think. Even though Lula, of course, as you said, is not entirely. He's not. I don't know how much did he know about this and how much is going on. But the economy, as you said, the indicators are positive. I saw a figure that inflation is estimated at 4.36%. In a recent poll. This is, by any standard, this is great here in South America, Latin America.
Yes.
I'm also curious if we can talk about the package that Lula launched on the 6th of April in order to measures to cushion the impact of international energy price volatility. Perhaps we can talk about that.
Yes, so the government is trying to avoid a sudden rise in the prices of fuel. And this package, basically what it does is to reduce taxation on gasoline and diesel as well. And also there has been some recent measures to reduce the prices of, I don't know the word, the term in English, but it's the fuel used by airplanes. And I think there has been an attempt to deal with that. But for those listeners who don't know much about Brazil, I think I should mention that Brazil is in a much more comfortable position to deal with this crisis because right now Brazil actually exports oil. It's true that we still depend on imported oil from other countries because the oil produced in Brazil is a sort of heavy oil that is not that good to produce gas. But yet I can tell you, since the war on Iran started, I didn't notice any major increases in gas prices. And this has to do with the fact that right now we do not depend much on imported oil, different from other South American countries. And actually, this is something that is probably going to benefit the incoming government. This is going to be good. The fact that oil prices are rising, this is going to be good in terms of government revenues because Brazil's oil giant Petrobras is a government-owned company. And when Petrobras has record receipts, record profits, this is good for the government. This means extra receipts. And some economists, they are saying that Brazil's fiscal deficit is going to decrease, mainly because of an increase in oil prices. And it's interesting because when Donald Trump was elected in 2020, right? Many people here in Brazil, they were worried about Lula is going to face a hostile federal administration. But right now, it seems that actually Trump's administration has not been bad at all for Lula and for the PT, the Workers' Party, because some of the measures he took, for instance, increasing import tariffs to penalize Brazil, they had the opposite impact. Because in the end, this had no impact whatsoever on the Brazilian economy. And the government was actually able to profit from this case because he used this dispute with the United States to boost a sort of nationalist discourse. And this was actually bad for the opposition because Jair Bolsonaro, as you may know, he's very close linked with Donald Trump. Brazil's far right has very close connections to the alt-right in the United States. This proximity with Donald Trump, I can tell you, this is not good for them because I have seen some recent polls. I think the opinion of Brazilians about the United States, it's probably at a historical low. Most people here don't have good opinion about the United States. And now we have the war on Iran. And in the end, this might happen. This might help the government in these final months, just because the government is going to have extra revenues. That's it. So it's actually a sort of paradox. And some people here in Brazil say that Donald Trump is the best American president that the American left could ever wish for, which is actually funny.
President Lula has been quite openly critical of the US and, of course, US foreign policy. This obviously plays to his base. Is it likely to draw in more support in the coming months?
I mean, it's hard to say because I don't think that foreign policy issues, they are going to matter much in a presidential election. Because in the end of the day, voters, they are worried about more practical issues like how much am I going to pay to put gas in my car? What about the prices when I go to the grocery store? I think this kind of stuff, have much more pressing issues like crime and corruption. So I don't think this is going to help Lula substantially, but still, I would say that on the other hand, Trump is becoming a sort of deadweight for the Brazilian far right, because association with Trump now, it's definitely not good. If you want to win an election, if you are a gubernatorial candidate or you're running for Senate election, it's definitely not a good strategy to associate yourself with Trump, because Trump is a very unpopular figure here in Brazil. Not only here in Brazil, I think in many other countries here in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. I think he became a sort of deadweight loss. And also I see a sort of contradiction and in terms of the far right's discourse, because on the one hand, they have made a very strong, they have actually created a very strong narrative about patriotism and all this idea that the left is not really patriotic. Because you have these left-wing historians who mock, about Brazil's flag and our military feats, which are not many, to be honest. But then at the same time, they have this sort of nationalist discourse. They have adopted a position that, for some people here in Brazil, it looks a bit of subservient in terms of as if Bolsonaro and some of these guys, they are saying everything that is good for the United States is good for Brazil. And I suspect this is not going to help the far right to get more votes, because even right-wing voters, I think that in a sense, Donald Trump, he has become a deadweight for the Brazilian far right. And the reason for this is because Jair Bolsonaro and other far-right politicians, like the governor of São Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas, they have adopted a position that some voters may see as subservient to the United States. And it's almost as if they're saying that everything that is good for the United States is good for Brazil. And voters obviously know this is not true, because actually Donald Trump, he only worries about promoting U.S. interests, even if this means harming the interests of historical allies. And so I really think that, and the way they dealt with the tariff crisis when the U.S. government decided to sanction Brazil by raising import tariffs, I think it was a disaster in terms of media, the way because while the Brazilian government, President Lula, they were very quick and say, we are going to defend the national interest. We are not going to bend and accept some kind of external country interfering in our internal political affairs. I think the way Bolsonaro and Tarcísio de Freitas and other right-wing politicians, it was much more dubious. And I really think this was not good for them. And I would say that it's very likely that they are going to hide Trump in the campaign. Trump is going to become a sort of a non-subject, something that we'd better not even mention, simply because this is not going to help us in any way. Rather, this is going to be bad. This is going to be a problem for us.
How interesting that should be a situation, because we know that Flávio Bolsonaro, 44-year-old competitive candidate, has spent a lot of time overseas in recent months, becoming even closer to, let's say, right-wing movements. And then you've got what seems like the old political class, certainly old, and Lula is 80 years old. And so you think that Flávio Bolsonaro would try and be more dynamic on a domestic platform. Again, very interesting developments. And I would imagine that this recent, as we come back to it again, this recent package to subsidize diesel for transport, to subsidize liquefied petroleum gas, and tax exemptions on biodiesel. These are domestic things. And so I think that Lula has very much the idea that he needs to work at home and not, obviously, look overseas, yes, much as Flávio Bolsonaro has done. It's a very interesting and conflicting situation.
Yes, I suspect that up to now, Flávio Bolsonaro, he has not faced any real challenges. And the main reason for this is because in Brazil, if you are governor or senator, if you have a public office and you want to run for president or any other elective post, you have to resign. You have to resign. And there is a period of time, I think it's 6 months before the election, something like that. The deadline to... In Brazil, we have a very difficult word for this, is desincompatibilização. I don't even know if I can translate that, but basically it means that you have to resign, leave your office if you want to run. And the thing is, Lula's campaign decided not to criticize publicly Flávio Bolsonaro. And the reason for this is they thought if we hit Flávio very hard and he starts to... and this sort of affects negatively voting intentions, the opposition may try to replace Flávio by another candidate. And this candidate would be the governor of São Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas, which Lula and several of his closest allies think would be a much more dangerous candidate. And so their strategy was, okay, let's wait until April 4, because after that, they won't be able to replace the candidate. And then from April 4 onwards, we are going to hit Flávio very hard. And we are going to remind the public about various corruption and unexplained stories about how Flávio, he profited millions with a chocolate store and other very complicated stories that Flávio has never been able to fully explain. And so it seems to me that up to now, he has not had to make too much effort. Up to now, it has been very easy because in the end, the government, the PT is not criticizing me. And the reason for that is because they were just waiting, because actually they want to run against Flávio. And also, I suspect that part of the media has been very, let's say, they tend to be a bit sympathetic toward Flávio, especially the more conservative outlets. And they even, some journals, they refer to Flávio Bolsonaro, not as Bolsonaro, but as Flávio, in trying to dissociate Flávio from his father in an attempt to show the opposition candidate as more moderate than he really is, which, to me, this does not make sense. How can you be moderate? And he just gave an interview saying that if he were elected, the first thing he will do is to provide presidential pardon to the crowd that invaded the Congress and the Supreme Court in the 8th of January 2023. So he's talking about forgiving these people for trying to overthrow democracy. Someone who promised that he cannot be considered a moderate. But I see in part of the conservative press an attempt at rebranding Flávio Bolsonaro and presenting him as a moderate, which he obviously is not. I'm saying all this just to give you a sense of what is going on in Brazil and how Flávio's campaign up to now has been very easy because he has not faced any serious challenges. And I think the real campaign is going to start now. And the problem, as I see, is that Flávio's past a trouble for him. It's going to be an issue. He has a lot to explain, and I suspect he won't be able to come up with plausible explanations.
So if we wind this down, Andre, and we say that the key items are for domestic policy will be crime, corruption, and the economy, but we're more likely to see, as you said, a war of narratives between Lula and Flávio Bolsonaro.
Exactly. Yes. That's, I would say, this campaign is going to be about a war of narratives. And I would also say that it will be key to convince the independent, moderate voters. This is going to be crucial for either of the main candidates.
Yeah. If you were a betting man, Andre, where would you place your money? On Lula winning in October or Flávio Bolsonaro in October?
Well, that's a difficult question, Richard. I have to say, as a political scientist, I expect this to be a very tight election. But that said, and knowing from the past that the incumbent government in Brazil always has a very substantial advantage because, and I think during the campaign, it's very important to have people on the ground, to have mayors and local councilmen and all these candidates to state and federal legislators. If you have all these people campaigning for you, this makes a huge difference. And the thing is, when you are in the federal government, when you have this political machine, which is this very large, complex political machine under your control, this gives you a very substantial advantage. And I suspect that this advantage is going to be even more crucial in this election because, as I said, we have a more polarized electorate. Lula, he is not going to be able to convince, to change the votes of the hardcore Bolsonaristas, these voters who are very fond of Bolsonaro, and at the same time, they like Bolsonaro very much. They hate the Workers' Party, they hate Lula. And so, and the same is true for Flávio. Flávio, he is not going to be able to convince the hardcore Lulistas to vote for him. He has to mobilize the vote of more independent voters. And we know that these people, they decide in the final moments of the campaign. And these voters, they tend to vote according to more pragmatic motives. They are going to look at the state of the economy, and they may be more sensible to these campaign efforts at the ground. So in this sense, I would say that Lula, he is still the favorite in this election. But as I said, even if he is the favorite, my expectation is that he's going to win by a very small margin. That's what I expect. But all that said, I would probably not put my money on this.
Anyway, thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Andre Borges, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Universidade de Brasília, and also one of the editors of The Recasting of the Latin American Right, Polarization and Conservative Reactions. It has been a fantastic conversation with you, hearing about the actual situation and challenges facing Brazil in this lead-in to the elections in October. So thank you for coming on the LatinNews Podcast.
Okay, thanks. It was great to have the opportunity to talk about Brazilian politics. And I do hope our listeners, they have enjoyed this podcast.
Undoubtedly so. Remember, please, you can subscribe to the LatinNews Podcast wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and beyond. Remember, and never miss another episode. We will be back in a fortnight's time discussing further issues and items of interest from the region. I've been your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Thank you again for listening. Goodbye.